You came in that thing? You're braver than I thought.
Nice, come on.
The Millennium Falcon is one of the fastest ships in the galaxy.
It's the ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
No! But it can be a bit of a maintenance nightmare.
I'm afraid we'll have to replace it.
Especially if it's been modified.
What a piece of junk.
To help owners get the most out of their craft, Haynes proudly presents the Millennium Falcon Owner's Workshop Manual. Chock full of specs, repair tips,
Wait a second.
even piloting hints. Perfect for the next time you can't quite get up to light speed. Haynes will get you to the next galaxy.
Hi everyone and welcome once again to Geekfest Rants. My name is Carlos Peron and joining me I have James. Say hi, James.
Hello, hello.
Today we're doing a little different type of show. We kind of done something like this in the past, but let's go a little bit over how we ended up at this particular subject matter. We're doing the Millennium Falcon, which is basically our Star Wars theme shows that we've done in the past. And the last one I can think of, which was a two-parter, was our Stormtrooper show. And this is a show that we did a while back, and we look into the, if you want to call it the mythology or exactly, how do they function within the Star Wars universe. We're going to try to do a similar thing today with the Millennium Falcon.
We try to take fake characters and try to put them in the real world somehow and explain how they tick.
Right, because obviously, we're going to go over some of the real life inspirations for the ship and this and that, but within the Star Wars universe, we want to see exactly how does it function? What exactly does it look like? And where are the different sides of it and, different angles and different compartments and all that stuff? And we get to see some of it in movies, but a lot of it also comes from the EU. Now, another reason why all of a sudden the Falcon has popped up into our conversations is because couple of episodes ago, we talked about the potential Disney attractions that they might be building, and one of them was the Millennium Falcon, that they might be talking about actually building some sort of a ride or a walkthrough environment where you get to visit the inside of the Falcon. And this is, again, another one of these reasons. Now, let me tell you first about some of the sources that I've used for this. Not too long ago, they put out this big, fat, not too thick, but kind of large coffee table-ish type of book. I think it was called like a 3D Millennium Falcon. And you basically turn the pages. I think you're familiar with it.
Yeah, I own it.
You kind of flip pages. As you flip them, you're basically peeling the different layers of the Falcon to see
deeper. It's like books
in.
they've made about the human body. When you peel away the top layer, the skin, the muscles, the nervous system. Well, they did it with the Falcon. So you get into its hull. Then it's like some of its electronics. Then it's actual hangars and walk areas. And very neat. Even if you're an adult.
Right. And they also made, I believe, the same company made one about Vader, where you can, same deal, you get to peel away Vader. Well, as a matter of fact, the 3D book was written by the same group that wrote this book. But obviously this book is way, way more detailed than the 3D book. And by this book, the book I'm referring to right now is called Star Wars Millennium Falcon Owner's Workshop Manual. This book is put out by the Haynes Company, which is also the same company that puts out those actual legitimate car repair manuals and how-to manuals and, how to deal with cars and that sort of thing. This is kind of like an offshoot thing they do now, I guess, which is they kind of dabble in the fantasy world or science fiction world because they have somewhat of a line of sci-fi-ish science fiction themed owner manuals where they break down classic science fiction ships and vehicles for you to see how they function, if they were to function for real. This particular book is what I'm using for the majority of this episode in terms of sourcing. It's also what inspired me in a way to put the show together because it is so rich with information that, it's just a goldmine of material. The book was written by Ryder Wyndham, Chris Rafe, and Chris Travaz. And like I mentioned before, these are some of the same writers who worked on some of these other books. But I also used other sources. I also have, if some of you remember, if you collect these books, they call the cross-section books, the Star Wars cross-section books.
Yeah, they were real good.
Those were so cool, and I used to love them, and I can't wait till they do. Hopefully they'll do more of them when the next movies come out, because they really go into very, very fine detail. Granted, a lot of it, there's some very creative license, when it comes to describing some of these things. And the other not so much book, but more like a journal, like a magazine. Starlog Magazine, a while back ago, put out these technical journals, which were these mini kind of magazine size, not cross-section books, but kind of like blueprint type of books.
And I recall as far back, there were the blueprints that we've talked about in the past that came out of these sets of blueprints, as well as the sketchbooks had a very vague looking, cockpit, ramp, walkway as part of their feature in that section of the book that you got a little vibe, but it really wasn't that detailed.
Right, and the other book I would also mention is another recent book called Star Wars Blueprints. And this is a book that came out a couple years ago, which was enormous, which is actual reproductions, photographs of the real building blueprints of these sets. I have a version of that book. It's not the expensive one. It's the cheaper version. But it does have some blueprints of the Falcon. But again, you got to keep in mind, these are construction blueprints, so they focus mainly on external sets and internal sections, not the entire ship, but like here's one little section, here's another little section, here's another little section. So there's a lot of data out there to kind of put it all together. So let's go over, first of all, the concept of the ship itself as far as the movie goes, the creators of the film. From what I remember reading one of the making of books, I believe it probably was the making of Star Wars, makes the most sense. The initial design was what we recognize better as the Eagle from Space 1999.
Sure, it's really what became the Tantive 4, but with a Millennium Falcon cockpit on the front, but it was too much like the Space 1999 ship.
And they got pretty far along in terms of building a prototype. The artwork that McQuarrie was drawing was based on that prototype. All that stuff was happening. And then at the last minute, it was like, you know what? We have this other show taking place in England, as a matter of fact. And it was way too close. They were way too similar. And I guess I don't know if they were afraid they were going to get sued, but they were at least afraid that they were going to be compared.
Yeah.
So from there, like you mentioned before, they kept the ship, they kept the Eagle design, but they used it for the Tantive 4. They changed the cockpit, like you said. But then they took that cockpit, the original Millennium Falcon cockpit, and brought it over to a new design, which was the hamburger design. And tell us about the hamburger.
Lucas basically at that point just said, make it like a hamburger with an olive. Now, I don't know if those words were actually spoken to anybody or if that's what, romantically the backstory became. But I've heard them describe different ships. The Slave One was basically like a lamp,
iron?
a street lamp.
A street lamp, an iron,
So this does make sense based on what we've read over the years, that it would be something as simple as that, a hamburger with an olive poked in with a toothpick.
Right, and it's a bizarre design. If you think about it, nobody can accuse them of stealing that from anybody because it's just odd looking.
And it's such an important ship. It is basically like the hero ship.
It's a character.
The main, exactly.
It's like the Enterprise.
Yeah, I was going to say that was the next example I was going to use. It's that important in the Star Wars universe, and that it have its own personality, and it certainly does. And the cockpit was basically just carried over based on Lucas's use of a lot of World War II imagery to at least get the, what they call animatics now. The cockpit of like the B-52.
Right, like you can see through
was very similar to what the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon became.
Exactly. What Lucas hoped he could turn it into, it's referred to as the sunfish design. And this is apparently, think of like a sunfish type of deal.
Yeah.
Where the cockpit sits either in the middle or on the side of this triangulish, roundish type of body, and the entire ship rotates around the cockpit.
Which was used later in a Clone Wars type thing.
Correct. They were later able to adapt it, but initially, just that concept mechanically would have been way too difficult to turn it into a special effect.
In 1976.
Exactly. They needed something a little more unmechanical, unmovable, easier to control. However, later, for Return of the Jedi, they were able to incorporate that design when they put together the B-Wing fighter. If you remember, the B-Wing is a cockpit, and the entire ship, once it's flying, can rotate around the cockpit. Now, the thing about the ship, through time, they developed their own history for the ship, their own mythological history, its own canon history, if you will. And what we know about this particular ship, it's that it's a Corellian freighter that comes from the Corellian, planet. And
from Corellia.
From Corellia, that's right. Which is where Solo is from also.
Yeah.
If you look at the book and you go through the history, the particular model that the Falcon comes from and the different types of Falcon-ish looking ships that exist, it starts off with the YT-1000. And this is supposed to be an older ship, kind of circular body. It needs a crew of 2 people to navigate the ship, just like most of the other Corellian Falcon-type designs. This particular one can handle about 4 passengers and has a cargo of 75 metric tons.
This was like an older version.
Right. Let's keep in mind, these are freighters. So most of these ships, they haul freight. They haul stuff around. They're made primarily for that. If you think of the shape of the ship, we talked about this before. There's a new Rebels cartoon that's about to come out later this year. I'm not sure. I forget exactly. But it kind of looks like that. It has this kind of...
It's a bulkier version of what could be an ancestor of the Millennium Falcon.
Yeah. It's a little more angular, but it's still a round design. And one of the easiest comparisons of the movie Alien, the escape ship at the end.
Yeah.
Do you remember the name of that ship?
That was the Narcissus.
Right. It looks almost exactly like that, believe it or not. But that's kind of like the grandfather of the Falcon. The cockpit is in the center. It's not off to the side. The rear engines, it actually has rocket engines in the back instead of that long blue Falconish type of engine. Now that gives way to what we are more familiar with the Falcon designs. Now the Falcons are the 1300s, the YT 1300s. And the 1300s come in 3 models apparently. You have the P, the F, and the PF model. The P model is basically very similar looking to the Falcon size-wise and where things are located, except that it's more of a passenger internal built ship. It can handle about 9 to 15 passengers. It can only hold about 25 metric tons of cargo, which means it distributes the space inside the ship differently. It has 3 passenger cabins, which is a lot of passenger cabin for a ship. It's primarily built to carry people, to ferry people from place to place. It doesn't have boarding ramps like the Falcon. The Falcon has a boarding ramp. This one does not have a boarding ramp. It basically has a hatch and a ladder. That's how you get people in and out.
Well, that's the funny thing about the Falcon. There's so many things that we don't quite get.
Right.
The ramp, where what we know as the ramped entry to the Falcon, also was... I guess I was, over the years, reading different things. It can attach, like we saw at the end of Empire. It can also attach, allegedly, on the side, which is a combination of, like, escape hatches.
Well, I'll tell you about that.
That's actually a hatch. That round side thing above the ramp is another type of... if the ramp wasn't able to lower... you would go, the ramp would stay up and you'd go straight out that door to whatever gangway or something like that.
It's funny you mentioned that because according to the book, the 1300 Ps, the passenger models, at either end of the ship, at the right side or the left side, that's where the escape pods sit, some of them. In other words, at each corner of the ship, at each left and right side of the ship, you have 2 escape pods. Each escape pod apparently has 6 seats. So, like I said before, this thing can handle 9 to 15 people, so you have to be able to, eject 9 to 15 people if you need to. So you have 6 seats on one side, 6 seats on the other. That takes care of 12 passengers. But then you also have in the rear of the ship, in the engine room, just like the Falcon, you have 5 single escape pods that are hidden underneath the floor. And these are the escape pods that on Star Wars, we hear the Imperial commander or whatever saying, Lord Vader, some of the escape pods have been triggered, blah, 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 blah.
But they could have been launched like years ago. for all we know.
Oh, of course. But they somehow, changed the code so it looks like they were just triggered.
Yeah.
Unless he triggered them, after the...
Yeah, we don't see every detail,
right.
And that's the magic of the movies.
Right. But that's the funny thing is that we never see these escape pods. They kind of look like, from what I've seen, the artist's renditions, they kind of look like the escape pods that R2 and C-3PO used to escape from the blockade runner. It's a little tubular, round, eggish looking thing.
And what's funny is, like, a few years ago, the BMF, which was Big Millennium Falcon, or whatever euphemism you want to use for what that larger couple $100 Millennium Falcon was.
Yeah.
They had a little escape pod type thing that, again, looked a little bit like the Narcissus.
Wow.
That didn't make the original toy, but the later version in the 2000s, when Hasbro put out the giant version, it had like an escape pod. They were going to make an attachment to the toy that was supposed to be escape pod-ish.
Yes.
Back in the 80s, and it just didn't work out. It was one of those concept toys that never actually worked out.
Wow. Wow. Well, the other thing is that these escape pods, I'm talking about the 6-seater ones, the ones at rear end, they're sitting basically at the end of these passage tubes. Now, these passage tubes, just like in the Falcon, if you remember, if people come into the ship, a door closes so that the tubes are separate. They become airlocks. And it makes sense because obviously if an escape pod is triggered, you don't want to have the whole ship decompress.
Yeah.
So the doors close and the escape pods could be triggered without losing, compression of the ship. Now, that was the P, like I said before, the passenger version. The freighter, or the freight version of that ship, is more like what the Falcon is. The Falcon is supposed to be a freighter. Now, the freighter, or the freight model, can only accommodate about 6 passengers. Again, you're talking about a crew of 2 people, pilot, co-pilot, plus 6 more passengers. It has way more cargo. Instead of 25 metric tons, it has 100 metric tons. And obviously that's because there's not a lot of crew compartments.
I don't know what
cabins.
that actually means, but I get it.
Meaning there's there's more room for freight. There's more room to store whatever the heck it is that he's smuggling. But that particular type of ship, it could handle a lot more. Instead of 3 cabins, like I said before, it only has 1 cabin for people to sleep in, one area like that. This particular ship, now keep in mind, has 2 boarding ramps. Similar to the Falcon, it has boarding ramps on either side. It also has docking rings at the end, meaning that instead of having the escape pods, the 6-seater escape pods at either side, it has docking rings where you're supposed to be able to kind of, fly the Falcon next to another ship and connect it through an airlock to another ship so they can, get the cargo back and forth.
Spice back and forth.
Right. Like I said before, no multi-seat pods. It has the single pods in the back like the Falcon has.
Do you think he stole the spice idea from Dune?
Who knows? I mean, dude, that's classic sci-fi. You never know.
It's one of those things like they were smuggling spice, and spice was a big deal in Dune. I wonder if that was just a little kind of
and
nobody ever asked those questions.
And the monster in the asteroid is the worm.
Yeah, the sandworm. Yeah.
Now, one of the things they mention in the book is like, even though these ships technically are sold as a passenger version or a freighter version, people modify the crap out of them, so they never end up looking the way they did off the factory. Some people say, well, add me another cabin, or give me a little more of this, or add another gun here, add another radar here, that sort of thing. So they're very modifiable. Now, what ends up happening at some point is that the company ends up putting out a 3rd model, which is the 1300 FP. That becomes basically a combination of the other 2. In other words, it takes a little of both of those ships. Yeah. Instead of using 2 ramps, now it has 1 ramp, just like the Falcon. This one has a galley and a lounge area, so a little less cargo room, a little less storage space, but now you have like an open area for people, like a little kitchen and a little hanging out area. It still has a crew quarter to accommodate about 6 people, and it has 1 6-seat escape pod also located on one of the 2 sides. So again, like I said before, this is more of what you're talking about when you see a Falconish looking ship. What they also talk about is that even though you have these differences in these 3 types of ships, there are certain add-ons that you can purchase that you could say, well, maybe they have them, maybe they don't. One of the things they talk about is the engine and the cockpit locations. So in other words, it is possible to see Falcons with the cockpit in the middle or off on the other side.
And I'm wondering why. Like, I wonder what you just figure, I guess it's a situation like the driver's seat is on the left in America, but in England and Japan, it's on the right.
It's what you like. They talk about like engine types. Well, you can have rocket engines or you can have the traditional Falcon engines.
And I imagine Han Solo, whomever, whenever the Falcon was modified, it was built for speed.
It's like a car in terms of options. What options do you want? Do you want fog lamps? Do you want cruise control?
You want the 8-cylinder or do you want the 6?
That's exactly how they're presenting it here. They're also showing you designs where it's like, you want extra armor? They can put extra armor on the ship. Do you want extra cargo pods attached to the top of the ship? They could do that too. And here's one that's really cool. Pontoons. Do you want to be able to land the ship in water? And they show you that the ship could be fitted with either rigid or inflatable pontoons.
And the Falcon winds up in water in the Boba Fett Christmas special.
Well, what's funny is that you can have these things apparently installed if you think you're going to be doing it a lot. So in other words, if you're going to be visiting a lot of water planets, you better have them. But according to the book, the normal Falcon model is capable of landing and floating on water and taking off, provided, that the bottom of the ship is properly maintained. There's no holes in it or anything.
Yeah. Actually, in the comic book, the Marvel comic series, that's the one I'm more familiar with, there were a couple of water landings, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. So, again, this is EU we're talking about. We've never really seen it in the films. Like you said, you saw it in the cartoon once. It's here or there. I'm sure in some of the books might have it, but here they're giving you the option that, it is possible that thing could exist. The other thing they say that some of these Falcons could have is a freight loading external rover. And what this is like a little separate ship that is capable of detaching itself from the front of the Falcon, from like the mandible section between those two front sections, and it will go and grab your freight from another ship, let's say, and bring it back into your ship. But they're saying that it wasn't very popular because the ship already had like loading arms and a tractor beam, so it became kind of repetitive, and people would.
Yeah, well, if I'm not mistaken, based on, like I said, reading some of those things, and I built the model back in 1978, the AMC model. Like the front area with mandibles that's supposed to I guess hold freight.
Yes, it is.
Or like the mandibles are like more like a crane
it's
type
the
thing.
Primary,
the
mandibles are basically the primary way to get into the ship to load your freight. I mean, I'll explain to it later, but there are other ways of getting things into the ship, but the primary way is through the front. If you're looking at the ship right from the front, if you remember the scene in A New Hope where the Falcon is entering the Death Star, and they actually give you that front view of the Falcon, that black dark area right in the middle, those are apparently two sliding doors that let you bring in your freight.
Exactly. That's supposed to be where your stuff comes in. And actually, to be honest with you, where Luke and Han and Obi-Wan and Chewie are sitting is like cargo area. They're right in front of that is
that's the main hold right there.
It's like the hatch, the loading hatch or whatever, the seal. And then cargo would sit where Chewie and those guys were hanging out.
The last alternative thing that you can purchase for the ship that they mentioned also is a mini fighter. In other words, a one-man little fighter that attaches to one of the sides of the ship.
That's what the toy was alleging.
Where either a docking ring or an escape pod would normally sit, you would put a fighter there instead. And they're saying not a very popular thing except for pirates, because pirates wanted to kind of like have a secondary ship.
That was the little extra thing that the toy was trying to build.
I know. Now, the book also goes a little nuts in terms of saying, that's the Falcon model, the 1300, but they also had other models, the 1210, the 1250, the 1760, the 1930, the 2000, and then they talk about something that called the 2400. The 2400 might be a little familiar to Star Wars people because it's the Outrider. If you remember the Outrider toy from the Shadow of the Empire.
That was a short-lived thing from the Prince Zizor series.
Yes, the Shadow of the Empire game.
Oy.
But what's interesting about that ship is the fact that even though it's an EU thing, apparently that ship made it into the Star Wars
special
edition. It's in the corner as you enter Mos Eisley. As you drive into Mos Eisley, you see it taking off.
Yeah, and that's a lot of crap because that was just a way for them to tie in those crappy figures that look like He-Man.
It's an Easter egg if you think about it. It's an Easter egg. Yeah. Now, let's talk a little bit about, how does this relate in terms of the story of the book? According to the author here, and again, his sources are very all over the place. There are books that have been put out, a lot of EU material, but for viewers of the films, primarily the history of the Falcon that we know is really Lando and Solo.
That's right.
The ship, by the time Han Solo has the ship is already 60 years old. So it's been through a number of hands.
There was that slight little scene in episode 3 where it's supposed to be...
I have that here. Don't worry about it. We'll get to that.
Yeah.
The ship apparently has had about 4 or 5, maybe 6 different owners before Lando gets his hands on it. As a matter of fact, what you just said before, on one of the previous names of the ship, because the ship apparently has been renamed a ton of times. At one point, it was called the Stellar Envoy, and we actually see it landing in Coruscant during the Battle of Coruscant at Revenge of the Sith. It's very small. It's one of these things where you need a magnifying glass or somebody on the internet to point it out. It's
again another Easter egg. But Lucas says that's definitely the Falcon. It's just painted slightly different, I think.
According to the book, it has like royal colors on it. It has like these greenish blue stripes on it, which is like, okay, fine. It's, again, another Easter egg they throw at you.
which is nice.
The myth of the story is that Solo apparently tutored Lando. When Lando owned the Falcon, he kind of showed him how to properly fly it and that sort of thing, because these guys were friends. And at one point, when Solo was in the academy as an Imperial Navy officer, in training, that's where he hooked up with Chewbacca. He apparently liberated him.
Yeah, which people forget. Like, we've talked about this different thing about stormtroopers and the Imperials. Han was part of the Imperial, he was part of the Imperial Navy at some point.
He was in training, yeah.
That's the same thing with, like, Luke wanted to join this academy, which was the Imperial Academy.
Exactly. And through the academy at some point or another is where he meets Chewbacca and liberates him because somebody's holding him either hostage or slave or something like that.
By that point, the Wookiees had been established as being part of the story from Revenge of the Sith.
And the connection then from Solo to Lando is that apparently Solo wins the Falcon from Lando at a Sabacc tournament, which I guess it's some kind of card game or something. Sabacc?
Yeah, I think I don't know how it's pronounced, but that's how it's spelled.
Tournament or something like that?
Were any of these stories presented in the Lando Calrissian book series or the Han Solo book series?
I don't know if they actually were from those books or if it's just backstory from what we hear in Empire. I'm not sure which or the other. I don't know if they ever do go deep into the
Han Solo at Star's End. I recall that book, but I really didn't read them in detail. It just didn't catch my, fancy. And then there was the Lando Calrissian series, the Lando and the Mind Harp or whatever it's pronounced, whatever it is. I wasn't as big of a,
and I'm sure
I wasn't as big as a nerd, I guess.
There might be some more modern books that go into that because it never ends. It just never ends, the amount of information that comes. And like I mentioned before, that Millennium Falcon book that apparently has a lot of information that, again, it's all EU, but it's up to you whether you want to consider it canon or not.
Well, you mentioned Disney. Disney is soon or going to evaluate what's canon, what's not canon. I think they're going to stick with what canon is what's on the films, like George says. That way, when they make their other movies or their other series, they can kind of have carte blanche and,
Right.
They'll turn it into something completely different and they'll say, oh, well, that's our version of EU. Don't worry about it. Episode 7 is still gospel.
Yeah, they can rewrite the whole rule book for all they know. You never know that.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about specifically the Falcon now. Externally, I'm not going to go too crazy about it because we kind of all know externally what it looks like because we've seen it a million times. It's internally what I'm more concerned about, more interested in, because there's so many different areas. And again, like we said before, if they ever turn this into some kind of a ride or a play set or something like that.
Even a simple walk.
Yeah, this is where they would have to, mine for information for
you go through
location.
That in between, the Ewok ride or, whatever.
Well, like I said before, the Falcon is supposed to be the freighter version of that model ship. And it has been, according to the story, modified tons and tons of times, not only by Han Solo, but by the previous owners. Han Solo has, upgraded just about everything on the ship to make it, a super hot rod type of device. In terms of, he's got some military equipment that he shouldn't have and he can get in trouble for, that kind of, I guess it's like somebody putting like nitrous oxide on his car and stuff like that,
The Fast and Furious in space.
And like I said, not only tech, but military upgrades. Let's talk about a little bit like the layout of how the ship, you can walk around it. Initially, I thought this was a circular corridor that basically takes you everywhere. But when you take a really closer look to it, it's more like now think about this, a reverse or a backwards number 6. So in other words, it starts on the top of the 6, it goes circular, and then it completes the circle underneath the 6. You know what I'm saying? So that's how it kind of takes you all over the place. One of the things I noticed in this book that I've never seen before, and it was there all along, and I don't know why I missed it, is that in the cockpit, the ship is actually flown there is an actual control. There's a yoke in there that it has this, it's silverish and it's kind of pointy and it doesn't look like a wheel. It doesn't look like a plane. It's a completely original looking device for the pilot and the co-pilot to hold.
I think if you look closely in Star Wars, you might see it in the widescreen versions and stuff. But as a kid in the original versions, you're not focusing on that. And then at the home version at first, they were pan and scan, so everything was tighter. And now that we have the ability to maybe get, you think it's something they added or something, but it was always there.
It was always there. And I'll tell you, I think the place you see it the most is on Empire when Leia is flying the ship at the end of the movie.
She's smaller, and you get to see.
And one of the reasons why you see it and you don't see it before is that when you see Chewbacca flying it, his hands are so furry that it covers the entire thing he's holding.
He could be holding onto the dashboard.
He could be holding onto anything. But with Leia, you actually see what the whole device looks like. So that's an interesting thing that I've never noticed before.
I would like to add just something just for the fans and, non-fans or whatever look for. There are hanging dice in there. And they're definitely there, and you see them, and again...
And they disappear right away.
You wouldn't necessarily see them on the pan scan, and if you were a little kid on the big screen, it might go past you, but they were always there, and it's really a cool little thing.
They're there in Docking Bay 94 when Chewbacca first goes in and is firing up the ship. He bangs his head on it, and they go flying.
The kids these days don't get the thing about the dice, but that was a big thing in the late 60s and the 70s.
They're very small, they're metallic, so it's hard to see. You blink and you miss it.
It became a little bit like a cliche having the fuzzy dice or something in some of the lowriders.
I think it's probably an American Graffiti Easter egg.
Yeah, exactly. I think Falfa probably had them there.
But like I said, I have not seen them in any of the other films, only in because like I said, you see them coming in and then they never appear again. So I guess you could say, well, Chewbacca was in such a rush, he knocked them over with his head and they went flying somewhere.
Yeah.
All right, well, this is going to bring us to the end of part 1 of our Millennium Falcon special. Please join us next week as we will continue delving into this particular subject. We have lots of areas to continue to explore, including more of the internal workings of the Falcon, plus the fate of the constructed Millennium Falcons from the past, and of course, we'll take a quick look at the toy lines of the Falcon, how they were made, and how they're different, and how they progress through time. Until then, I'd like to thank James for joining me today, and you guys for listening, and we will see you here next time on Geekfest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
What a piece of junk!
She'll make 0.5 past light speed. She may not look like much, but she's got it where it counts, kid. I've made a lot of special modifications myself. But we're a little rushed, so if you'll just get on board, we'll get out of here.
Hello, sir.
Stay sharp. There's 2 more coming in. They're going to try and cut us off.
Well, why didn't you outrun them? I thought you said this thing was fast.
Watch your mouth, kid. You're going to find yourself floating home. We'll be safe enough once we make the jump to hyperspace.
I'm going to make the jump to light speed.
Take a few moments to get the coordinates from the Navi computer.
Are you kidding? At the rate they're gaining?
Traveling through hyperspace ain't like dust and crops, boy. Without precise calculations, we'd fly right through a star or bounce too close to a supernova and that'd end your trip real quick, wouldn't it?
What's that flashing?
We're losing a deflector shield. Both strap yourselves in. I'm going to make the jump to light speed.
Oh dear. Shoo, shoo, ghastly beast.